everyone, and welcome to Gaming Mechanics, a podcast that seeks to explore the unexplored topics of games, how they work, and why we love them. With me here today is Anonymous Kangaroo.
Woohoo! It's
AKA
Greg.
Greg. And today,
Otherwise known as Anonymous Kangaroo.
yeah, he has an alias in our Google Doc. So,
Or this week, anyway.
who knows what's going to be next week? It's always a
I know.
fun,
Tune
a
in next
fun
week
animal.
to see
Animals
what
I didn't
goofy
know
name Greg
existed
has.
are in Google's little animal selection algorithm. It's very impressive.
Yeah, haven't there been, there's so for those of you who don't know, there's just if you enter a Google Doc without like a account, then it just gives you a anonymous and then an animal. But I feel like there's been times, there's not real animals in there too, right? Haven't I been an anonymous unicorn before?
Yeah, I think you have. It's interesting to see them differentiate, like, graphically between the different types of animals. Like, even animals that are similar. Like, how do you
Yeah.
differentiate between, like, rat
Yeah,
and
simple.
mouse?
Well, it's fun because I never know what I'm going to be either.
Exactly. So,
Mark has to tell me. It's always a tiny little adventure every week.
very small surprise. But anyway. Speaking of, yes, go ahead.
Speaking of bad segues, we are doing bosses this week.
That's right. And that intro was like a boss. So, there we go.
Yes, it was. It was. Well, at least you nailed the. We for our intro, a podcast seeking to explore that part. We are both Whose Line Is It Anyway fans, and anytime there's got to be at least, what is this, episode 24? There's probably at least like 28 instances where we've attempted to do the intro and said a show where, and immediately gone into everything's made up and the points don't matter. Like, just instantaneously. It's insane. Like, it's just this, we're programmed. So if we say a show, it's over. Like, it's not going to work. If we say a podcast, then that will actually result in the correct words coming out.
It worked. I focused a lot on saying podcast. Anyway.
Yes, and you nailed it. So. Excellent. Okay, so we're doing bosses this week, and this actually came from, originally we were going to be doing, we're talking about just the way to end games and the ending of games in general, and a big part of that, obviously, for many games is the final boss, a very, very famous part of video gaming, history, and as we were going through it, as tends to happen, we found that we had too much for one episode.
It's a good problem.
And then even as we went through bosses, we found, so we separated out just bosses in general from like the ending of games, which we're gonna do next week, / kind of throughout the end of the year as a kind of the end of the year sort of thing. But also, bosses is also a huge freaking topic too, as we found as we were going through. So this might actually even be a starting point too for a small series on bosses. We'll see. Depends on how it's received / how we feel about it at the end of it. But it turned out to be quite the topic to tackle, in terms of what bosses, why we have bosses in the first place, which could be probably its own podcast, but also what the best bosses are, and which ones are bad, which ones are good, why they're such. So we got plenty to talk about here. Let's just jump in. Mark, do you want to talk about just kind of that question of why do we have bosses in the first place was an interesting one that gave us pause.
Yeah, I think that would be great. So for the very first boss encounter that you see in gaming was in 1975 in a game called D&D, like D, the letter N, and then D. And it was a golden dragon at the end of the game, basically. And so I realized when we were tracing back the history of game bosses that actually it was going to inevitably tie into why we have final encounters in narratives just generally, which is a much bigger topic than what I wanted to cover in the podcast. And so while that is an interesting question, the answer is basically that we imported final encounters from existing practices in D&D at the time, which no doubt tie back into just storytelling in general. And so we have bosses because we have final encounters and narratives. And then I would say that the genre of video games and the video game industry did something different with that, though, because bosses started to become more diffuse in games. They started to be, you'd have 8 bosses in a game, not that unusual. It would be weird to have 8 climaxes in a story. Like, it would feel like a serious roller coaster.
Right. Yeah,
It would
precisely.
feel like the whole book was just setting up for the next final encounter, which would be
Right.
weird. But it works in games in a way that it doesn't really work in a narrative, which
Yeah,
is
to have huge encounters that are notable to the point where you can name them as something else outside of the normal narrative,
right.
um, over and over. Which is interesting because if you think about like even original like go way back to really really old games, think about like the end, and this is getting a little bit into endings, but like think about like non-narrative games, right? Like Pac-Man, Tetris,
Hmm.
like Asteroid. They don't have final bosses. They just
Right.
have you beat the game, you finish the thing, you know, um, or like way back Pong. But like yeah, games without narrative didn't really have final encounters
Right.
for that reason. I think was this they you did the hardest version of the game that they had,
Right.
and then you were done.
The
So
final boss was like the challenge built into the game, and
right,
so it isn't surprising to see that the idea of a
Minesweeper.
yeah, right, yeah, Minesweeper, the idea of bosses came in through the more narratively driven genres, in this case an RPG,
Right,
and in
it
some ways
was
it's kind of stayed there. We'll talk about
mhm,
the different genres that actually this is a good segue into
yeah,
what
do that.
genres have bosses and which genres don't, because there are some genres that really resist having bosses. Obviously, for
Yeah,
almost any genre, you can come up with an exception where they tried to do something cool where there was a boss.
right.
But
I
in
think
general, there are certain genres that just it isn't usually done.
I think it's a really good way to put it too. That they're resistant to bosses almost,
Yeah.
where like you can put boss encounters probably into almost any genre, and you can see games try to be creative like that. But there are genres that are just seem to be more designed for that, where it flows well, it feels right, feels good, and other ones where it's like, oh, there's a boss here, that's interesting, let's see if this is good, and then usually it's not. So again, in general, and with most of our podcasts, and I feel like I've been saying this a lot lately, but there's tons overlap here. None of this is going to be totally nailed down, but in general, I think we got some pretty good trends. So in terms of the genres that immediately came to mind, right, of the best bosses, tend to be probably not surprisingly like the RPG adventure games or action games, right?
Yep.
Similar in the similar vein of D&D. So think about any turn-based or real-time RPGs, MMOs, are very boss-heavy. Adventure games like Sonic or Link or Link, Zelda,
Right. I mean,
Mario all
going back
have
to
bosses.
Castlevania,
Um,
back in the beginning. Um,
right, exactly. And then into the more modern games, think about like God of War, defined bosses in large part. Shadow of the Colossus is a whole game of boss. Um, then you have other let's see here. Then you have like fighting games, for example. That was another interesting one where just because of the nature that fighting games are matchups 1v1
hmm
in general, they actually took very well to having big huge final fights because that was the whole game again,
Right.
where you have M Bison, Street Fighter 2, Shao Kahn in Mortal Kombat 2, Goro in Mortal Kombat 1. I think the original boss in Tekken was Jinpachi Mishima, and then you have his sons throughout the rest of the series, that were all pretty spectacular, incredibly difficult too. Fighting games were notable for just basically, and we'll get into this in a second in terms of different types of bosses, but fighting game bosses tend to just be stupidly hard versions of the rest of the rest of the
Right.
game. It was the same thing, right? You were still fighting on a 2D plane. You both had 2 health bars you had to reduce. Generally, they'd probably have a little bit more health than you, but there usually wasn't a huge new mechanic that introduced. It was just these ridiculously stupid, punishing enemies that you
Right.
had to fight.
And
Which for fighting
typically,
games works. That actually, when you beat them, it feels like you really did something special.
yeah.
Um, and you mastered the mechanics of the game. You had to be the best to beat this guy, and he was the best. A lot of times, fighting games tend to be like tournament based too, even within the narrative of the game.
Right.
And so it feels like you finished off the best guy, not you're the best guy. So that actually works really well in fighting games.
And I think another common thing that developers try to do in fighting games is they use the final boss as an unlockable character.
Yep,
And
yep.
so
I was
you
just thinking
can't
that
have
actually.
him be like a god tier where he has like moves that will instantly kill you, because now when you're playing that as a character, you don't have that move. And
Right.
so they have to restrict the move set to actually be fair, because they're usually going to be in the game as a player versus player option at some point.
Right, and it tends to be right a character you haven't encountered before.
Right.
for that reason, right? That it is special and it's singular. It's not just another character that you could possibly fight or play as at any point. It's something new, and you have to learn it as it goes. And of course, like I said, there's always exceptions to that rule. Even like think of some of the later Marvel vs. Capcom games where you fight Galactus, I think, and he has a few like if you screw up a certain mechanic in the fight, then it becomes one hit KO, or he'll shake up your roster and make you play with different characters, right? So there's different ways to do that. In general, I think fighting games tend to be in that realm of pretty straightforward and simple, but that work really well with bosses and final fights. Some games that actually don't do this too well, in my opinion, lately, unfortunately, were some of my favorite fighting games, which is the NRS NetherRealm Studio games. The more recent Mortal Kombats and Injustices actually were not too great at that in terms of their final encounters and story mode. But I think that's less. Those games weren't quite as. There's so much to do in those freaking games that the final boss wasn't quite as important, I don't think. But in any case. Then, I mean, so Mark, you have actually probably more experience in MMOs than I do. Want to talk about MMO bosses and just the bizarre kind of subset of bosses that they have?
Yeah. So, MMO bosses are really kind of a unique thing. So typically, an MMO boss will be found at the end of like a raid or an instance of some sort. So typically, it'll involve the cooperation of a lot of characters, and the MMO is going to be, or the boss is going to be a little bit more like a puzzle, frankly, for a bunch of people to talk about and communicate with. About, how do I beat Onyxia? How many priests do I need? How many druids do I need? Onyxia was a dragon back in World of Warcraft. It was a kind of a boss that people raided and did every few days. I think you could fight her. But in any case, one
of the big original end game bosses for an MMO.
Yeah, it was a big deal, and you'd hear people strategize and talk about how the most effective ways to take down that dragon. And I guess I want to say they didn't play like normal bosses. Like you had to cooperate, and you really couldn't fight them on your own. An MMO boss has got to give a huge sense of scale. Like you've got 30 to 40 people in this raid fighting this one boss, and so the scale has just got to go through the roof because it still needs to feel epic, even though you're with this veritable mob of other characters and players.
Yeah, and that's a weird point too, because MMOs make a point to try to make you feel as powerful as possible when you're playing kind of like in more PvE, like kind of more almost soloable content. Like you have to feel like the hero in those times, right? So you have to feel really buffed up, really powerful, and you're downing things. That's one of my big gripes with MMOs in general, is that in large part you're usually killing things that you shouldn't be killing at places when you shouldn't be killing them in some ways, in terms of like you as a character or as relative power level. You have to feel so powerful that you have to kill so many powerful things that eventually it becomes kind of like a Dragon Ball Z-esque whatever it was that you killed earlier that was supposed to be super cool just isn't cool, and they have to keep on ramping that. But anyway, the point is, then when you get to an end game boss, then you have 40 people who are supposed to be like that level of epic, so you really have to ramp it hard. And I think the one thing, and this is kind of a theme that we found as we were talking about bosses in general, was that, again, kind of unsurprisingly, the best bosses, particularly within their genre, are ones that really take advantage of their genre and test you in the ways that are specific to that genre. So in this case with MMOs, like I said, with fighting games, similarly, you really have to master what you were doing, and fighting games are made up of their reaction time, learning an opponent, and utilizing your own character and mastering your own character. And that's what you have to do to beat final bosses in fighting games. In MMOs, it's kind of appropriate in some ways that it's not about single players. It is far more a social aspect. It's the raid as a whole it's far more about cooperation. When you talk about like if you're to watch big huge raid bosses get downed like on live streams or VODs, it's actually not too exciting to watch in some ways, because the game world isn't the important part. Coordination between the players in the world, that's really the hard part, and it's a little bit harder to see the skill involved there, which is extreme. It really is.
Yeah, it's really hard to get an appreciation of like all the intricacies and all the planning, and like you couldn't just watch a live stream of downing a raid boss and then go do it yourself. Like you have to
Right.
study like party composition, what moves are they having? Like, okay, they've got these druids,
Timings.
and yeah, exactly. Like, can who's an off tank and who's a healer, and like
Oh yeah.
and there are usually specific mechanics that have to be figured out, like, at this point in the fight the boss is going to pick one character and everybody has to move away from that character because they become a bomb. There
Right.
actually was a WoW boss that had a living bomb curse. um,
Yep.
and
Plenty of them.
so everybody would back away from that character, but you'd have to know to watch for that debuff, and
Right.
all these fascinating little things that involved player coordination. And like you said,
It's also
the game genre focuses on player coordination, so in some ways I think that's a brilliant design for a boss, is to require people to work together.
right, and that's the other part of it, right? If you're just watching, particularly if you're watching like a healer, or even just, I mean, I think usually the most in normal MMOs, the most interesting people to watch would be like tanks. They're kind of the most the ones that have to manage spacing in the 3D world, or aggro. So the who's going to be fighting who in terms of who the bosses or the mobs will be attacking.
Right.
But if you watch like a healer, that's the hard thing too. In a raid, they don't have 40-man raids in WoW anymore. It's kind of been standardized down to 25 is the biggest. Or is it 15, 20? I forget. Maybe Mythic is 20 now. Anyway, point is much smaller. And but if you're just watching one person, they usually have a job they have to do, and it's very specific, and it's kind of boring actually to watch. If you just watch one, it's very hard to get a sense of what everyone is doing all together to make sure that the numbers keep on ticking down on the boss and stay up on your characters. Because each individual person has kind of a very specific, almost boring task in some ways. That
Right.
sometimes they have to switch very quickly, but it's this is really interesting that is the way that shook out M&M in a massively multiplayer environment, was that the big huge confrontations do require primarily social skills, actually, in a lot of ways. Of course,
Yeah.
there's mechanics involved, but it's really the coordination that matters more.
That
And yeah,
is
you just straight up can't beat bosses by yourself. You can't be good enough to beat the boss, right? Like
right.
it's just you need multiple people,
It
which is
is that
impossible.
that's an interesting idea, though, that individually it's uninteresting. Like, individually it's sort of like you become, a cog in the wheel, basically a cog
Yeah,
in the machine, a
more of an
gear.
organism almost.
Yeah, and like you can imagine, if you zoomed out far enough, that's really how it would feel. Like, imagine being part of a 200 person raid. Like, how
Yeah,
significant of a job are you really going to have? Like, at most you're going to be contributing like just over 200th of the total, effort toward fighting this boss.
right,
And
right.
so
Yeah,
like it's just, yeah, how could you not just feel like one little piece of this? And ironically, it starts to lose its epicness because you are contributing in such a small way to the fight. Um,
right,
Whereas you
right.
can go the other way, where the bosses isn't that hard, and then it loses its epicness because you don't actually need everybody. Um,
Yep.
but yeah, anyway, that's just two. It's interesting that there's two different sides you can fall off of in terms of the boss difficulty spectrum, where it's so
Absolutely.
difficult that you need so many people that you feel inconsequential, or it's so
Mhm.
easy that you don't even really even need yourself.
And I will say, in terms of the difficulty in feeling inconsequential, I think it's easier to, with MMOs at least, err on that side because, like, I mean, it is interesting if you watch a stream. I've done that where I've watched like the big, huge end bosses, particularly just for the story in World of Warcraft, because I was a Warcraft fan before WoW, and I've tried to keep up with the story a little bit, even though I don't play the game. And so I'll watch, the big final encounters, and like I said, in large part, they're hard to figure out. Slash, they're kind of obtuse, and especially if it's only one person, it's hard to get a sense of what's really important. But I will say, watch the end when they down them, and the mic shadowing cheers that come out.
Yeah.
There's a really intense feeling of accomplishment when you complete something as a team that is, I think, categorically different. So yeah, even though you did have this you kind of feel maybe inconsequential in the moment, there is some level of feeling part of a team. It's just a very natural human endorphin rush.
Right.
In terms of it just is very, very intrinsically satisfying to do something together, even if you had a small part. Being a part of that, I mean, just yeah, like watch even with more modern games, and or not more modern, I guess, because WoW's still around. But like Destiny is another good example, right? Where that's one thing they did was they did make it more. They have their end game is raids in a similar fashion to MMOs. And their bosses are tend to be similar. They're not just big bullet sponges. There's tons of different weird mechanics that you have to do, and you have to work together as a team to really down the boss. And I'm actually watching one of the Destiny raids right now, the world first clear on one of them, and similar. It's similar. It's a lot of trial and error, figuring out. It's really more of a puzzle as these 6 people work together to try to figure out these mechanics and then execute them. But the feeling you get at the end, even though if one person's only job was to go over, run, and get this ball on one side of the room and put it into this other side of the room when they were supposed to, so the boss will go down and its shield will disappear, that person still feels like they killed the boss at the end. So that's a really interesting, just kind of like human dynamic there. That even though you're right, your individual task might not be too important or cool, just through the power of teamwork. Does that really give you that feeling of accomplishment at the end?
Yeah, and I think that having really key mechanics like, having to hit the button at a certain time or having to transport this orb from one side of the room to the other, and if that doesn't happen, then the whole fight is wiped, does give you still a sense that you're a crucial component in the fight.
Yeah.
And I think that there probably is like that balance between scale and difficulty and having contributed to the team that MMOs have worked out over the last 10 15 years. And so I'm wondering if that's why Blizzard settled on that 20 number down from 40, was because you do feel like you have a little bit more of a role in the fight and you're not like the third string healer, oh well, I hope the other 3 healers don't die because then I'd be really important,
right. And I'd really have to actually do something important. Yeah, no, exactly. Totally, I agree with that entirely. And I think in part 2, like that's why you also see, like in Destiny, the big end game raids are 6 players, and then in WoW and a lot of other big MMOs, you actually tend to see the big huge ones will be, like I said, up to 20. But actually, the other big, more common form of content is dungeons, which are like 5-man,
right?
Where you basically have 1 healer, 1 tank, and 3 damage dealers of different types, and each one has a pretty specific, unique role. And if any one of those, I think I agree entirely. I think there has been a sweet spot that's been found where you need cooperation, but you also, you're right. If there's 4 people doing the same thing, then that's not as cool because you're just doing the same thing as someone else.
Yeah.
So it's funny. We've been talking mostly about other. I think the most obvious place when you think of big boss fights, or even if you look at lists of top bosses of all time, they all tend to fall into the adventure kind of RPG category, action games. So think God of War Soul series, the Blood Soul series, or Soulborn. Think like Shadow of the Colossus, good lord, I don't know, Kingdom Hearts. Certainly the Final Fantasy series in terms of RPGs. That tends to be where bosses really get their big names, right?
Well, a game that's recent that has come out that's all about bosses that we haven't mentioned yet is Cuphead. And
sure.
I thought that would be worth bringing up, too. Just like it is, it's a platformer, but it still has very much a focus on bosses. And I think that that's an interesting combo.
For sure.
The original Mario, you did have a boss at the end of sort of a whole world, but Cuphead is very much more about the bosses.
Yeah, absolutely. And the interesting thing too about Cuphead specifically is that it is something closer to a hybrid, like when you have a true platformer, think back to Crash Bandicoot or there's really no combat in it. The combat is in fact platforming, which is jumping on top of things or getting around them. In Cuphead, you do have the combat mechanic of at least the 2D shooting kind of Contra-esque gameplay. But you're right, I think the primary method of gameplay there is the platforming of movement and getting around things. And in large part, it's just making sure you're always shooting at the boss. It's not shooting at the right thing,
Right.
So yeah, Cuphead, I think. I mean, I don't know if you've played much of it. My roommates have it, and I've watched them play it and played a little bit myself. And it is really interestingly unique in terms of it's a combination of these basically just single boss battles, but as well as there's mixed in, which is the minority of the gameplay, but there are other levels which are kind of just called run and gun, which is just get to the end of the level sort of thing, which those feel more like straight platformers. So it's interesting that the game really was well taken, and this is kind of something that we were trying to figure out, different genres that take well to bosses and ones that don't, to having multiple different types of gameplay in it, where you're able to have very deep and very, very engaging and very fun boss battles, but as well as have kind of a more time-based movement to it. So it's something interesting about that 2D kind of Contra style that seems to work well on both styles, as
Yeah,
opposed
that
to
is
say
interesting.
like we were talking about the Arkham games, right? Seem to actually have a hard time with boss fights, because in large part the main way you play is supposed to be against multiple people. There's very few single encounter rooms in the game, and so they kind of had to develop ways to do that, and didn't quite work. Same thing with Deus Ex. Human Revolution was notorious for having a rough time there. But with a game like Cuphead, apparently there's something about that 2D style of play that is actually very easily takes itself to boss battles and larger, kind of classical traditional levels.
Yeah, I mean that's interesting to me. It makes me want to try to dive in and figure out like, hey, what's going on there? That 2D lends itself to being more flexible in that way, in a way that the 3D games have struggled to do.
Yeah, totally. I think it's a really interesting point. That could be a different episode.
Yeah, I think
That
it
could
could.
get into our 2D 3D discussion too that we're
Don't
gonna do.
don't give away all of our
Compromise.
series, Greg.
Oh, did we not announce that one?
I don't think we have, but we do have something cooking about 2D versus 3D games.
Oh crap! All right, you can
Uh,
edit that out then.
yeah. uh, okay.
Even that
Well,
we're gonna explore that at a different time. Yeah, it is really interesting that Cuphead is seems to be there's something just intrinsic about that style of game that lends itself well to both sides. And also say Cuphead's short too.
right.
It is, kind of necessarily think about another game that is just bosses. Famously, Shadow of the Colossus was
Yeah.
genre defining in that regard, which is literally 18 or 16 subsequent boss fights, with slight adventuring in between.
And it's
Um,
so well done. I mean, I just need to fanboy a little bit over Shadow of the Colossus here. I mean,
Go for it.
it's
Right
so
behind you.
satisfying to kill every one of the bosses, and like also there's I don't want to give away the story, but it's like satisfying and also like a little concerning, I'll say, to put it
Yeah,
mildly, to be killing these giant creatures that are inhabiting this world. Um,
absolutely.
and I think it's the way that they designed their boss battles and the sense of scale and the uniqueness for each one of the colossi uh,
Hmm.
are it just leads to such a satisfying encounter every single time, and I think that's so impressive. It would be easy for it to get like, oh, another colossus, can't believe I'm still doing this, but
Yep.
it doesn't feel that way at all.
And I think that's important in the pacing of the game, right? Like in fact, there's if you look up, they finished actually a full 20 colossi. Originally, they had thought they might do like 50, and eventually cut it way down, at least in conceptual. But even to the point where they did 20, there's another 4 you can find online that were completely modeled, and I don't know if they were completely finished in terms of mechanically, but you can find them, you can see them. And they were eventually cut for that express purpose, which was, for whatever reason, 16 felt like the exact correct number. When they did 20, it actually felt like it was too many, and some of the early ones began to feel either extraneous or just not really worth it, or there was a slog in the middle end of the game.
Hmm.
So they cut, like I said, 4 entire bosses, which at that point is a fifth of the game, which is substantial. But they did it for the pacing reason. I think similar to Cuphead, Cuphead is not a long game by any means. It's a lot of content in terms of it's really hard, so it actually turns into a lot of a lot of time.
Right.
But there's actually not a whole lot of individual challenge like boss fights. It's
Right.
a relatively small number, and I think that's probably exactly why.
Huh. And again, we run into like the Shadow of the Colossus really did specialize in boss fights. I mean, that's all the
Right.
game is.
That was
Um,
literally the whole game, which is in large part too something that hadn't been done. I don't think at that point. That was like 2004, 2003 when the original came out.
mhm.
Um, and I think it was also kind of the beginning of having the technology to do something on that scale too, just with the PlayStation, the
Right.
PS2, and hardware advances at the time. Being able to do something where you were fighting almost a literal mountain multiple times. Just you couldn't really do that. Certainly not in 3D.
Yeah, it would have looked
Which actually brings
terrible.
me to, I did want to give an honorable mention to Sonic Adventure, which is the
Yeah,
first 3D Sonic game, which I actually played a lot of on the original Dreamcast way back in the day,
dude.
and loved. And
There's you
the
get
final
so
encounter
much
in that
gamer
game,
cred
again, just kind of
for.
bring together the theme of the best games, the best bosses at least being, kind of great examples of the core reason that you're playing the game in the first place. In the case of Sonic, it's just speed, and the final boss in Sonic Adventures is Chaos. It's a big. I don't know how they came up with this. It's if you think Sonic, you don't really think giant water demon, but that's what Chaos was. It was this primordial water-based like entity that was, yeah, it was like this old god kind of thing that Dr. Robotnik found and managed to enslave to his will, which I think is kind of funny. But so the last boss is a giant. It's like skyscrapers tall. He floods the entire city of New York, and is this huge dragon-esque entity in the middle of New York City made out of water. And he's like, the whole city is him. He's like, it's water. And you turn into Supersonic, which is awesome. You find the rest of the 7 Chaos Emeralds, and you just are normal Sonic but golden. And the whole last boss is, rather than the other bosses, which are kind of more the normal platforming using his homing attacks and getting around them and a lot of motion, this one is actually only, the whole point is the way you defeat him is you have to run through the entire city as Supersonic and get up to enough like a terminal velocity speed and then ram into the big dragon thing basically. And if you do that 3 times, then you'll kill him. And all of his abilities are based around slowing you down. He can't do any damage to you. He can only slow you down, and you have a time limit. So that's a really cool idea. Is like the whole idea of Sonic is just like speed, right? The very, very base idea of that game. The reason people love that game is the sense of speed you get. And the final challenge was literally just going as fast as possible, and things that tried to stop you from doing that. Which is really simple.
That's like a brilliant combination of, like, that's, to me, that's a game development company who knows what their game is about and knows the experience they're trying to give to their players, and then puts it into the boss fight in a way that's just fantastic. Because so there is a chance for for Sonic Adventure 1 and 2 to fall on their face in the final boss, because you become Supersonic and you're not Supersonic at any other point in the game. And so you've got this disconnection between what you've been practicing doing all game and what you're now able to do as Supersonic. They're very different. You can fly around like Superman, basically. And so it would be easy for it to kind of feel gimmicky at the end.
Yeah.
But because the whole game really does center at its core around moving quickly and getting through things in a way that is economical in terms of time, it still feels like there's a consistency of experience because you're fighting this boss with a time limit. And you still can go really fast, and you're still Sonic. So it's kind of like it works.
All the core things are there. It's just all turn up to 11, basically, right? Now the whole world that you've been in so far has been destroyed, and it's all flooded. You're Sonic, but cooler. You're golden now, and you have this cool aura around you. Mm-hmm. And it's also interesting in that game, Sonic Adventure, was notable for having, you played as multiple different characters throughout that game. You didn't just play Sonic. And it was notable for having a basically entire character that was a bad fishing game, Big Cat, which we could probably do an entire episode on. Big, he has a very special place in my heart. My brother and I played that game together, and my brother, not Mark, that'll get confusing. My brother, who is not this Mark, I have another close person to my life whose name is Mark. But he wouldn't play the big part at all. He would play the other parts and made me, his little brother of 5 years, play the fishing portions. And so we beat that game. Like, Mark finished that game, or my brother finished that game way, way before we actually played the supersonic level, because it took me so long to bring myself to play the fishing levels. Jeez. So like that, this is a great example of both like that brilliance of the final supersonic sequence of like, okay, what's Sonic all about? Moving fast, getting rings, avoiding obstacles, and this really cool experience of speed. And we're gonna put that into the end. And then someone else in the development team was like, okay, or we could have you actually sit down and fish for a non-negligible portion of this entire game. Like,
You
Like
know,
I can't think of a mechanic that's actually less Sonic than fishing. Like it almost sounds like an Onion article.
and actually, I wonder if that's why it was put in, and we might be getting off into the weeds here, but
We are
like
a little bit, but
the it is sort of like you can think of Biggs as like an anti-Sonic. Like
it was
he's
actually.
not
I
agile, he's
remember
not
reading a
quick,
developer entry about this.
and he is kind of a break from the really fast action of the rest of the
Precisely.
game. Even the other non-Sonic characters, Knuckles flies around, and
Yep. Same thing with
Rose or whatever
Tails,
her name is, Tails, like
Amy.
everybody's pretty quick. Oh yeah,
All of them
Amy.
are motion based. You go quick in all of them. Yep.
Yeah. So
That's the whole idea.
anyway,
And Biggs was big, rather not Biggs, just big. Yeah, that was the idea. Was they were trying to like give some different feels to the game, but like fishing, like that is so like
that
fun. Then do
is
like an exploration thing or like I don't know, puzzles or
fishing is
I
so
don't know.
Ocarina of Time. Fishing
God
is
Almighty, it was boring.
fishing is so Animal Crossing. But
Yeah, it was remarkable that they actually did that. But anyway, so that
back
was
to
all that
bosses.
to say. The final boss in Sonic One was really good, despite the fact that it did go into that sketchy realm of giving you new abilities or new powers or new something that you weren't before. So that kind of brings us to like think about like what makes a really good boss good,
Right.
which is I think in large part that piece of again with exceptions, but again I think it tends to be if the game has trained you in a certain way, you've been doing something, you've been getting better at it, you've been unlocking new ways to do certain things. A boss is just the big huge final exam, the big test of your ability to do those things.
Right. And
The
and
final
very
boss
much
is a really big one, but each individual boss, right, can be different types of different levels of the game where you really have to be good at something.
I would say very much like a final exam. You don't want to get the player to just do all the things that they've done before. Like you do want
Right.
them to use all the same skills that they know how to use, but you want them to put those skills together in a new way.
Right.
Same thing with a test. Like it's funny to me when I work with students a lot. I'm a tutor, and I hear people complaining about how on final exams they ask me to solve this new problem. It like uses all the same math, but it's a completely different way of like approaching the problem, or it's a completely different type of problem. It just requires the same skills though. And I'm like, that is a perfect final exam question. Like you are taking you're taking the skills, but you're being tested on knowing how to apply those skills. And so
That
I
is the
think
point.
in the same way, a final boss tests you on applying your ability to dash or to jump or to dodge, but in a way that is different than a lot of the enemies before you have required you to do.
Just the God of War series is one of my favorites. I've played all of them, all the console releases anyway, and particularly the big huge finale in God of War 3, which is the end of the storyline, even though it wasn't the last one released, is a big fight against Zeus. Spoiler, by the way, for a game that's 7 years old. Um, and it's multi-stage, so it's a multi-stage fight, which is something pretty common with particularly final bosses. But the great thing about that fight is that each different stage is a different type of combat. Basically, God of War is all combat-based. Basically, there's some puzzle solving in it, but the whole point is pretty much combat. And there's three distinct parts. There's one where you are fighting just one-on-one, actually in almost 2D scale, kind of like a fighting game. It's very interesting, even though the game's 3D. That really tests basically your reaction times, being able to memorize patterns in his attacks, and blocking, and then being able to hit openings. And the second part is you're going to be fighting him inside actually you're inside the Titan Gaia, which is kind of cool. But he'll separate into a bunch of different forms, basically, clones of himself. And that is like utilizing your crowd control abilities, right? That you've been learning throughout the rest of the game, where you have these big, huge swarms of enemies with one bigger kind of mini boss enemy. And it's exactly the same thing. You have all these weaker Zeuses that are fighting you, and then the main Zeus, who has more powerful abilities. You have to figure out how to kill a large thing amongst many smaller things. And then the final aspect of it is more a cinematic. It's not as much a challenge. It's more a cinematic, kind of QTE, quick time event sequence, which is kind of classic of the God of War games, where you get to have this incredibly brutal execution. So it's each element of the God of War games really distilled down into these three phases, which is just fantastic. And they're hard. God Almighty, they're hard. So when you finally beat Zeus at the end and you get that final QTE where you just get to smash his face in, basically,
Mm-hmm.
with your bare hands, it feels like you earned that. So I think that's a fantastic example of great boss design. lining up with what the game asks you to do in new and separate ways.
And on the topic of like narratives and the ending fight, like it is tough to work in exposition to something that's fast paced as a boss battle. And
Yeah.
so I think that's one of the reasons why you end up with pretty heavily segmented boss fights where like the fight will happen and then there'll be like an epic moment in either a series of quick time events, which I think is a brilliant way of involving the player with what would otherwise probably be just a cinematic, or you could just
Cutscene, yeah.
have a cutscene where the fight concludes and something happens or you get some piece of exposition about what you did, because it's really hard to have that in the fight.
Right.
Because if you think about a boss battle, just usually in general, but especially a final boss battle, um, there isn't that much storytelling that happens in the boss fight most of the time.
Yeah, it's very hard to do.
Some boss battles you'll get like you'll hit them and then they'll like say a phrase and then the fight will continue or something like that. But Half-Life 2 did that a little bit. But
Mm.
in general, you like have the fight and then that's distinct from like the actual narrative progression that happens in the game after you beat a boss, because typically they're the keeper of some significant thing in the game that
Right.
has a narrative component to it, but that doesn't actually happen in the fight, and that's interesting.
And that brings me actually a really good point that Mark brought up earlier when we were talking, doing kind of the pre-show stuff. Was we were trying to think of like why, in general, particularly with final bosses, why bosses tend to be just one. Why there's only one of them. Why it's not a multiple thing, or multiple characters at least. And the answer we came to in large part was going to be exactly that. It was going to be narrative, more so than the game design mechanic part of it. Some bosses, some of the hardest bosses of all time, particularly, shout out to Orstein and Smough, or however you pronounce the second one. But the dual bosses in Dark Souls, which are it's two different people you fight at the same time, and when you kill one, the other one gets stronger. So you actually have to pick. One's really big, slow, and ponderous. It can one hit you. The other one's really fast and moves around and has really lightning quick attacks. Mechanically, that's like the hardest boss in Dark Souls, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's not the final boss. And I think in large part it's just a lot harder to, particularly if you're fighting two people. Mark, you brought up the fact that like, yeah, if you kill one, that has like story consequences,
Right.
and the game should be able to adapt to that. But you can't really when you're fighting the other one. You can't like wait and like have, as well as having choice means that there's just multiple different endings that you could kind of unlock, which most games don't want to do. So it's an interesting thing. Like I said, I think mostly with final bosses, but that, yeah, really the narrative portion, the big climactic moment of the story, particularly in action and RPG games, does tend to come down to the protagonist and the antagonist, and that's a very comfortable place to be.
Right.
And so for that reason, you tend to only have one person you're actually fighting. Even in like in the case of Zeus, he cloned himself out, right? But it's still the one character.
Yeah.
Period.
Yeah, you don't have different characters with different narrative significance. Like it's just clones of an existing character. I do think that's an interesting theme. I wouldn't say it's like necessary. I think you probably could make it so that you could kill two significant people in one fight, but you do have that weird. It is narratively a little clunky because if it takes, imagine you kill one and then it takes 10 minutes to kill the other one. Well, for like
Right.
10 minutes, that really important character is just sitting there dead, and you're not really sure what the consequences of that are. So typically, what games
Right.
will do is have like a prelude boss, or like you can think of Ares and Zeus in the beginning in God of War, where they're like back to back, and I think that's a more effective way of doing it. Clearly, is how the industry has decided to handle that. If you've got multiple
Yeah.
significant characters,
Singular fights back to back, and that's actually, again, to go back to God of War. Now God of War 2, the main antagonist in that game, the final boss is actually Zeus again. Again, shocker. But the penultimate boss, who you think is going to be the final boss, is actually the Fates. Remember those from Hercules, the sisters,
mm-hmm.
who get to decide what happens to everyone. They're the main bad guys for most of the game, and so they are three sisters, and you do fight them in sequence. In fact, you fight two of them at the same time, which is really hard. But there's a really cool way that again, I mean, spoilers again for a multi-decade-old game. But the way you have to kill them, you can defeat them one at a time. Like you're fighting two sisters at the same time, and you can defeat them in whichever order you want. But the only way you can kill them is by killing them like together. Like you have to use one to kill the other. Basically, it's kind of messed up. So that's the way that God of War 2 got around that was basically having like a defeated state and then a like end state. So you can defeat them in which order you want, but then to move the narrative forward, you have to kill them at the same time.
Interesting.
So that's one way out of that. But again, God of War I think was pretty notorious slash exemplary in the way it handled boss fights and just action set pieces as a whole. Was really the standard for a long time there.
Yeah, let's talk about some bosses that kind of fell flat. It seems good to me.
Yeah. So the ones that I have the most direct, at least came to mind for me, that I had the most direct experience with were a few ones you guys probably heard of and a few you probably haven't. The final boss of Bioshock, or just bosses in general in the original Bioshock, are generally regarded as the weakest point of a otherwise masterpiece game. And really, they're not horrible in all things considered. They're not. They are definite low points of the game. Particularly, I think the final boss feels oddly anticlimactic. Deus Ex: Human Revolution, I think I've even talked about on stream before. That game was notorious also for its boss fights being not really lining up with the point of the game, as well as feeling anticlimactic in terms of their endings. Another one of my absolute favorites, Arkham Asylum. They got a little bit better in Arkham City, but Batman Arkham Asylum was also notable for having a bizarre and stupid final boss and
yeah, can you talk more about that? Because that to me seemed like a really interesting case of not doing what I said Sonic did, where you kind of keep a consistency of experience between the battles.
Yeah. You mean for Arkham?
Yeah, for Arkham Asylum, specifically in the Joker fight.
Yeah, the Joker fight. So that's so again, I think I've talked about with the Arkham games, those can be really reduced to two things, right? The stealth predator mechanics and the combat mechanics. Combat has always been about being Batman and engaging way too many people at once in a way that feels really fluid and cool, and you're against insurmountable odds and you're just in complete control. Same thing with Predator. You are a singular, shadow in the night that gets to creep around these areas as your enemies slowly become more and more terrified of you as they get taken out one by one. That is like the Batman fantasy, right? What isn't the Batman fantasy as much is being on top of a roof with helicopter lights shining down on you and having this giant ogre that kind of looks like the Joker throw explosive barrels at you. And the only way you can defeat him is by basically dodging out of the way when he tries to jump. He gets stuck in the floorboards and then you punch him. That is the end of Arkham Asylum.
Right. And like so, the fight as you describe it sounds much more like the ending of a Zelda game than it does the end of a Batman game.
Totally. And the difficult thing is so the interesting thing with it's not hard at all. Actually, it's very, very straightforward. It feels like a really simple arcade game from like the late 90s or something. But two, it also doesn't play upon, the what's the core essence of the Joker? Is it this giant, huge, hulking beast that throws explosive things? Like, no, that's not why the Joker's scary. Exactly. Similarly, what's the essence of Batman? Is it being on a rooftop with like newscaster lights shining it down on you as you're fighting a giant monster? Like, no, that's like the job of someone in like Dragon Age or D&D.
Yeah, it's not. So the cool thing about Batman isn't that he has he can throw a good punch. Like that is a cool thing about Batman, but that's definitely not the coolest part.
Right, totally. Yeah, I guess the final sequence where you get to punch the Joker in the face tons of times, then you have this big final huge jump up in the air punch feels pretty cool. But again, that feels more like Dragon Ball Z to me than necessarily Batman. The interesting thing about that game is that the hardest parts of that game / when I felt like I finally actually beat that game was twofold. One, it was when I found all the Riddler trophies and solved all the riddles and finally found the Riddler in his fort and beat him and took him down. That felt like a huge accomplishment. And two was the challenge maps. Actually, there's outside of the game, you have challenge modes where you can go and play basically the big set pieces, either the combat or predator missions, and have certain objectives, ways you have to take people down, or certain things that you have to, certain combos that you have to be able to do, and yada yada yada. And when I finished all of those and got 3 stars on each one of those, then I felt like Batman. Like that was the hardest part of the game too, was beating those challenge maps. Which again, if you're paying attention, is exactly what the game was those combat and predator set pieces. Just cranked up to 11. So best way to do that would have been somehow working that into the narrative, having those really difficult large combat encounters stealth encounters or puzzly encounters built into a boss fight, which is difficult to do, and they got a little bit better in Arkham City. Actually, I haven't played Arkham Knight because I'm cheap and I don't have a PS4. But I don't know if they actually got any better. That's one game I've managed to not spoil for myself after like 4 years. I don't know what happens in that game. I don't know anything about that game because I loved Arkham City so much, and I told myself I was eventually going to get Arkham Knight, and I still haven't done it after like 5 years.
That's
4 years, maybe.
That's impressive though.
So
that you
don't
haven't,
spoil.
You haven't spoiled it.
I don't even know what happens in that game. I don't know the plot. I don't know what you do. I don't know anything.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, I think what you're talking about with the challenges that are sort of external to the game is what makes a good boss fight, right? To like make you engage with the content of the game in a way that is creative and different, and they place restrictions on you so that you have to go about the challenge in a specific way. And I wished that the final fight would have been more like that. And I get like the trying to make it epic with the Joker, but they didn't play on the Joker's strengths, and they didn't really make you do what they had been training you all game to do. Combat was a part of the game, I'll give you that, but not really the most interesting part.
Well, not even that type of combat either. Like I said, it was mostly against fighting tons of people at the same time.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
Around, not just one. You just had to dodge. Like you have one dodge move in that game, which when you have tons of people, it makes sense because you can't have multiple types of dodge. But against one person, when he's just throwing explosives at you, barrels, like you just dodge, and that's it. And then you wait until he attacks again, then you dodge again. So I mean, bad bosses, I think in general that's something that tends to not line up, particularly with the type of game that the game was, right? I think it tends to be, at least in those three examples with BioShock, Deus Ex, and Arkham, they just felt very disconnected from the things you were actually supposed to be doing in the game and who you were. One interesting thing I don't have too much experience with it, but also don't really know what I think about it is the idea of like a boss rush, right? As made popular by Mega Man in large part, where instead of a final boss, you would just fight all the bosses that you fought before in sequence, right?
Yeah, well, so typically it's not instead of a final boss, it's a precursor to the final boss. So,
right before yeah.
Right. In the Mega Man games specifically, you will always go through all the bosses that you previously fought, and then that will unlock a doorway to the final boss.
Okay, gotcha.
So there's a couple different ways.
I'm trying to think of what I think about that, especially even in terms of what we're talking about. Like in some ways, like that is the ultimate form of training you, like doing the thing that you've been trained to do, because that was just the whole game, was getting through the game to the bosses. And you have to fight them all again in sequence.
I think probably it started off as a way to add content to the game without having to add a lot of development time.
Yeah, that seems to be the
it's like
there, right?
The free bosses, right? You've already made them. You just put them in the game again, and that way you get twice the amount of encounter for your boss creation time. And most of the bosses in Mega Man were interesting and unique enough that it was kind of interesting to fight them again with a new arsenal, because by the time you finish the game, you've unlocked a bunch of new weapons and a bunch of new skills, and you can fight them again. There's a couple different ways that the Mega Man games have gone about this. One is to have the bosses be identical, and the other way is to have them be slightly more powerful than before. Which I think that's actually a bit more satisfying when you beat like a better version of them.
Totally.
Otherwise, it's sort of like, well, I already beat them once. If nothing else, I can just do the exact same strategy as before. I probably have even better weapons, though, so you can kill them pretty quickly. You've already learned their attack patterns and everything, and so it's not that interesting of a fight generally. The goal is pretty
especially
much...
with, like you said, the fact that you have leveled up as a character in some way, shape, or form.
Right.
Just playing the same bosses again, that would just be a really hard line to walk as a developer, to make sure that they still felt kind of hard, but not too hard. Especially as being the same, without just like making them have more health or something.
I think the point of a boss rush is twofold. Number one, it's to make you feel really epic, because now you can kill 8 bosses right in a row without even dying. Right, because you have to kill all 8 without dying.
Yeah.
It doesn't save your progress. To show how far you've come, exactly. I think the other thing is it does serve to whittle your health down for the final boss, and so if you can't really school these bosses, then you will enter the final boss with less health than you otherwise might have, which makes the final boss more difficult. Now,
See, that's a really interesting. That's a really interesting idea too. Is like basically give like saying, okay, how good it like the final boss will be as hard as you are good, right? Like if
right,
you are good enough where you can just trash the boss rush and enter into the final boss, you have an advantage. If you
right,
can barely skate your way through the boss rush, um, similar to like Pokemon, right? Like think of the end of like Pokemon Red, where you have to fight the Elite Four, and
right,
then you fight your the real final boss, your rival. And if you barely eked by the Elite Four, and all your Pokemon are low on PP and or have half of them are fainted, then you'll get trashed by Gary.
right,
But if you get to, that's an interesting gating mechanic because it's not even just about beating those bosses; it's about the entire end encounter, basically,
right.
right? Like there are gonna be times where you could actually beat the Elite Four and be like, "Crap, that's not good enough. I didn't actually." And you have to restart, right? Like you just know at that point, like, no, I'm not gonna be able to beat Gary. I need to try this again.
Right.
Um,
It prevents that, like, oh, I just got lucky phenomenon that might otherwise
totally,
happen.
totally. That's cool. That actually encourages mastery as opposed to just
Luck.
eking by, right?
Right. It's like, oh,
That's
like
really
my horn drill hit this time, so I was able to take out that final enemy. And like, could that
right,
still happen with Gary? Yeah, but I think it
right.
reduces the chances of you getting lucky.
Totally, totally. Oh, that's cool. That's interesting. And I wonder if that can be done. We'll talk about this more next week. With we're gonna begin transition to talking about the ends of games, which that'll probably be more of a series too. I think there's a lot to talk about there, but I wonder if that role, that like depleting your resources and making sure you're not getting lucky, it can just be served not necessarily by a boss rush, but also by like a final stage in other games, where it's taxing all of your resources in a way that yeah you can beat the final level, but if you didn't beat it well enough, then the final boss is going to be really hard,
Yeah,
or
well,
like impossible.
for a
I
while
wonder if
there
that's
was
done
there
in other
was like
games too.
there was a trope in at least in Mega Man games, probably just in platformers in general, like the easy boss hard stage or hard stage easy boss sort of
Sure.
duality, where like you knew
Yeah.
if a stage was just killer, the boss probably wasn't going to be that bad, um,
Uh, Interesting.
and vice versa. If the stage was really
Right.
easy, you're like,
Walk
dude, this
through it.
boss is going to trash me, and
Interesting.
I think that there is. Yeah, like if you can make it all the way through a stage, then maybe that really is the challenge that the developers were going through, and then the boss is just sort of a cherry on the top, and then vice versa. They don't want you to complete a level without actually having learned a skill. So
You know what game doesn't give a shit about that,
what?
or any of this that we've been talking about?
What?
Dark Souls, basically.
That's yeah, no,
Dark
that's
Souls has
very true.
almost no rules to their bosses. There's no sense of like, hey, if this was too easy at this point, then we'll make this harder. If this was too hard at this point, we'll make this. No, nothing. There's no rhyme or reason.
No, it's all difficult, pretty much.
Not when they show up, not when they kill you, not how hard they are in comparison to the stuff around them, not how to get to them. There's like a game is, and we always keep on. I feel like we mention Dark Souls almost every week,
It's true. Yeah, no, that's
but
probably true. It is, yeah, it is a game that we recently played together, but and
that's true.
it does have boss. I mean, Dark Souls is this the bosses in Dark Souls are such big set piece moments that like it is almost it's just below Shadow of the Colossus level in terms of how big of an epic deal they are, but they're a
Yeah,
pretty big deal.
yeah, and in terms of challenge, I would also maintain probably. Yeah, I don't know, man. I'd have to go back and play Colossus again to think about how hard each one was. Particularly those games, the Colossus bosses are more puzzle bosses too.
Yeah,
In large part, you have to figure out how to get to a place as opposed to really doing good at getting there. In large part, the Dark Soul bosses are less puzzly and more just really friggin' hard. Like mechanically to figure out and how to do the thing. Like when we were fighting the giant moth boss, the fairy moth sort of thing,
yeah, that
and we
thing.
just like we figured out all of its attack patterns. We were just like, yeah, no, that roll when it shoots those three beams, and if it randomizes to do that three times in a row is really hard, and if you miss one of them, then you're gonna die. Like
Right.
that's just hard. You
It
just
was
have to
just
get
it was just an execution component at
right,
that point. Like we knew how to beat the boss, we just couldn't get our fingers to do it.
right.
Um,
I literally just used the phrase "get good" without like unironically. Like I see how that came up. We
uh,
just had to get good. That was just it, man.
in
You know what
terms
you
of
had to do.
timing, though, like I remember walking out of just like a hallway, and then there was just like a boss there. And it was like
Yeah.
we like had just saved. There was just like a little bonfire, and there was a blacksmith. And I'm like, oh,
Right.
cool. So this is like a little like home base for us. And there's a boss like
Right.
literally on the other
And then
side
we
of the
got
door.
murdered right outside of it. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it's like
Yeah,
yeah. So in terms of spacing, completely random.
yeah,
Um,
or pace, you know? Like,
yeah,
there's almost no pace to those games.
it felt very strange. But it was
It's so
definitely
fascinating
challenging.
that worked so well. Like we usually usually we use Dark Souls as our foil at the end of our episode, you know, where we're like, but Dark Souls didn't really do this, or like Dark Souls got a pass, and like Dark Souls is obviously one of the most highly regarded series of the past generation, you know.
Right.
Um, it's just so fascinating that it gets away with so much, you know, like it doesn't adhere to those normal like power scaling or like character building or pacing or difficulty scaling or narrative elements, you know, like none of those bosses had stories behind them, and yet they were so. They just it's a good game. It
Well, I
worked.
think the expectation is set a little differently now with Dark Souls, especially
That might be true.
that you can get away with more because well, it's Dark Souls. Um,
Yeah.
I do think there's something to be said for a game which is all about the challenge. Like old games, definitely, it was about the challenge. Like it was
Yeah.
okay for the final encounter to not have much narrative significance because nothing in the game really had much narrative significance. Um,
Right.
there wasn't much narrative to speak of because games just weren't that cinematic and they weren't a great storytelling medium. The
Yep.
amount of
So,
content that you could fit into a game wasn't that satisfying. Everything had to look more or less the same. Think of like a Pac-Man level because they couldn't store that much interesting information in the game in terms of
right.
level design. So like if you're always in the same setting doing roughly the same thing just with slightly harder enemies, how much of a story can you really build? Um,
Yep.
and
Yep.
so those games I think the conclusion to those games often wasn't really narratively based and was more just about the challenge and the difficulty. And the reward wasn't the end of a narrative. The reward was, oh, I was good enough to beat this game. That's awesome. I'm pretty good at
The
this.
final score screen.
Right, exactly. You can put your name
Gotta
in
put your initials
and
in.
claim
You
your
know.
spot. And I think
Yep.
Dark Souls inherits more from that legacy where it's the reward is being good enough to beat the game.
Oh,
Um,
totally.
and now
Totally.
there is, of course, I know that there is narrative to Dark Souls, and there is a backstory, and it's probably really cool. Don't send me angry emails about saying Dark Souls has a story. I know, but most people who play the game aren't really going to get the story because it's pretty
Yep.
hard to access.
Very obtuse. Yes.
Right.
Destiny-esque in that regard. But very deep and very, very good. So,
So
that I think. Well, I don't know what we're gonna do next week. Honestly, Mark and I are gonna have to talk about it because we had a lot more content for this cast that we didn't even get to.
yes,
That
yeah,
I
we
think is
did.
interesting. Breaking down different types of bosses, some worth mentionings, different traits, and so I don't know. Maybe we'll do a part 2 next week, or we might transition into like we were talking about, kind of with the end of the year, how to end games well. And
Right.
one interesting topic there was how to end games well without bosses, and games that did
Yeah.
that well. Um,
Yeah, you
I had a
don't
few, just some of
necessarily
my favorite games.
need a boss to end a game well, which was an interesting thing that Greg, you came up with a few games that didn't have bosses and still had compelling endings.
Right, and the ones, some just my favorites. I'll never forget playing the end of Halo 3 for the first time, with the Warthog section, or Warthog rather. It's not a boss that ends that game, and it's fantastic. Love the end of Halo 3. One of my favorite and only really racing games I played a lot of was the PS2 version of Need for Speed 2 Hot Pursuit, or Hot Pursuit 2 rather. That the end of that game obviously isn't a boss fight. It is a ridiculous 9-lap race with all of the supercars in the game, and you get to pick one, and you have to beat all the other ones, and it's hard as hell. It takes like 40 minutes to even try once, but when you finally come in first in that course, it feels like just gold. Some of my other favorites: Red Alert 2. The end missions for particularly the Soviets, and Red Alert 2 is called Polar Storm, which is really freaking hard and is just a really hard RTS map. The one where you have to destroy the Kremlin as the Allies is also just, that's really simple. There's no boss there. You just have to break through all the way and slug your way through Russia. Fantastic ending. StarCraft 1's ending is fantastic. Again, not a boss there. You just have to break through. Utilize all your RTS skills to fight overwhelming odds. The original end of Battlefront 2's campaign, I know we talked about Battlefront 2 last week, but the original ending of that campaign is you play it's Hoth. You play a modified version of the Hoth map, where you have to basically enact that's the Empire's biggest victory in the Star Wars movies is Hoth. That's like just an absolute defeat for the rebels, and you get to play as the company that carried that out. No boss at the end, just you get to play as Vader at the very end, and kind of seal the deal there. But all of those felt like kind of really appropriate finales for a game in a way that each one of those genres felt like. Battlefront's all about the big the big feeling of a story of a giant battlefront that you play on, a big battlefield. And Hoth is a huge one, and you got to utilize all the different, you could play as an AT-AT, or you could play as an infantry, clearing out the ice tunnels and so on and so forth, taking down the shield generator. And so each one of those games didn't have a final boss and still felt hugely appropriate to its end. So that was my personal list.
Yeah, I think that's a great smattering of narrative conclusions that don't involve like one big encounter with a specific person or nemesis.
Right.
But they still effectively conclude the story. So we're going to be talking more about endings and what makes good endings, and just some sort of philosophical problems with ending games in general next week. And I think that'll be pretty interesting. So join us for that. We've got so much more to say about bosses of different types and different genres. We may very well revisit this topic. Let us know what you think about bosses. Maybe what are some of your favorite bosses? What are some of your least favorite bosses that fell flat for you? You can email me, mark@gamingmechanics.net, or Greg at gamingmechanics.net, and we will be happy to respond to those. So.
Absolutely. Stay tuned. Like I said, we got all kinds of ideas for the end of the year, and then we also have some ideas for the beginning of the year too. Also, Mark set up, I think I already mentioned this, but Mark set up an excellent streaming setup between the two of us, seeing how we're far away. That should allow for much better streaming quality, and we're excited to do more of that. I think partially the holidays this week just kind of was hard to find time between the two of us to set up time, but it's something we want to be doing more of, and so be on the lookout for that. And until next week, take it easy. Hope you had a good Thanksgiving.
If you enjoyed this episode of Gaming Mechanics, check out our Twitter @GamingMechanics or our Facebook by going to facebook.com/GamingMechanics. Thanks for listening.